Good morning, everyone. Hoping you can hear me. If someone can let me know, that would be excellent. I'd appreciate it. We're going to do our second part on respectful workplace today, and we've got quite a bit of information to get through. So oh, excellent. Thanks so much for telling me. You never quite know. I've had some technical difficulties, as a few of you know. So we're going to talk about, get a little bit more. We talked a little bit more theory last time, which I know might have been a bit dry, but we kind of had to get through it. The next section we're going to walk through really is going to talk about how we personally can make a difference, what we can do for ourselves, what we can do for others, and also organizational elements. I'm going to do a follow-up right at the end on the confidentiality piece. This is so critical for respectful workplace. So we're going to get at it. I've got quite a few slides here I want to get through. It's going to be quite informational. I do have a little tiny little situational thing we'll go through as a team. Having said that, let's get off to it. I just got a few little ones that we've talked about already. That's just for anyone who hasn't been on the, wasn't on the previous call. So we all agreed and everyone felt comfortable that this was a good definition, kind of gave some context to it and really set the bar quite high, actually, in terms of what respectful workplace is. So a respectful workplace is one where all employees are treated fairly, difference is acknowledged and valued, communication is open and civil, conflict is addressed early, and there is a culture of empowerment and cooperation. So again, it's not necessarily just the, the standard of here's what harassment means, etc. It really goes to a higher level of what respectful workplace needs to be. In terms of looking at, second, now I'm having some technical difficulties. Different computer, apologies, just one second. There we go. So we talked about the definitions of harassment and bullying and discrimination. And of course, harassment and bullying are sometimes used simultaneously, the same sort of definition. Other ones have different variations. Some people have definitions written in their policies separately, other ones don't. So again, as I talked about before, there's some nuances there. And of course, discrimination really falls under the human rights legislation. Now, one of the big things I just want to mention as well was our reasonable person test and the GRAMA test. So would most people consider the action unacceptable? So when you talk about respectful workplace, is that true? If you're in doubt of something you did or you're about to do, would it be something you would do in front of your grandmother, your spouse, or your child? So that's sort of a way to sort of all of us just have a moment of pause to think, oh, did that come out? That didn't come out properly. We all make mistakes. We all say things maybe or do things that may have not met that test. So then it's a matter of how do we take ownership of it, apologize, you know, talk to people about it as appropriate for the people that may have been impacted. And oftentimes it's not actually something that really impacted people badly. And if you've got great trust and a great relationship with them, it might have just been, you know, not something they just let roll off their back and it really wasn't an issue, where other times it can go to other extremes. In terms of, this is from Harvard Business Review, and, you know, I had an issue with this one. That's why I wanted to bring it up. So, and just everyone to go on mute there, I'm getting a bunch of background noise. It'd be great for everyone. So when someone behaves poorly or offensively, bad feelings spread and behaviors escalate, sometimes becoming aggressive or dysfunctional. But how do we know what's a behavior that's poor or offensive? Right? This is the nuance. This is why respectful workplace is so challenging. And with the Me Too movement and everything else, which has been so fabulous to get people to speak up, it's a matter of understanding what this means individually as well as an organization. So oftentimes I've heard over the years people say, respect, just give it and it'll come back at you, right? But the question then comes down to, what does actually respect mean? What is respect to me? What is respect to you? What difference does it make? It makes a lot of difference. Respect how I view it. Now, organizationally, we'll often set up some standards, right? We'll set up values, we'll set up behaviors, accepted behaviors within the organization or unacceptable behaviors in the organization. Having said that, there's always times when we have to sort of look upon ourselves. It's more individual, right? Because you can't write everything in a policy. We're all unique. We see the world from very different views. And how in the world do we deal with that? So, you know, we all have different perspectives. Some of us immediately see this and then we see birds. Some of us actually immediately look at something and see a face. So we all have different perspectives. We all view things differently. And no different with respectful workplace. And we have to treat each person individually, which again, it might sound so unbelievably exhausting to think about. It's really not. There's some really tried and true things, which some of you have seen some of these things before, but really play into it from an individual perspective when we really look at how we speak and how we act and behave in general. So again, the organization might have set up some standards, but everyone wants to be treated how they want to be treated. How I want to be treated might be very different than how you want to be treated. Now, there's obviously standards of civility in society. So we're not talking about those. We're talking about things on the edge of that. So incivility is a common word that is used now when we talk about respectful workplace. Some of those things in terms of being civil to each other go into this piece. So how am I going to be affected? If you treat me the way I want to be treated, or if you don't treat me that way and you notice it and you correct your behavior, that's fine too, right? So we know that the thing here is we can control this ourselves. There's many things that we can have impact on. When I do investigations and people are just mortified that something happened, oftentimes it comes down to they weren't thinking, they weren't noticing, they weren't listening, they weren't seeing how someone was being impacted. We all have good intentions, but sometimes our actions impact others in a negative way. It's a two-way street, though, just a little note there, such that if I feel, and this is where sometimes as teams you have to talk about it during respectful workplace training, is what's my responsibility as a team member, as your boss or your direct report? What's your responsibility? So if I feel like I'm negatively impacted, there's two choices. I either can let it go if it's something I think is small or it was just a one-time misstep by someone. If it's something that builds over time, maybe I have to deal with that. But those are the only two choices. Letting things fester will only make it worse. So you really have to come up with those ground rules. Now, not easy to do, easy to write and not easy to do. So let's talk about a few things that sort of get on how we get into our own way when it comes to respectful workplace. And again, you've seen a number of these before. So oftentimes, we create stories about somebody, and this is where I see things happening most times in organizations. You'll have a team, someone has a misperception of something, or some new person comes into the team, and they start creating assumptions about the person. They make up stories about that person, and those stories turn into beliefs about that person. And again, then there's an expected behavior. That person's lazy. That person's completely belligerent or disrespectful or whatever the heck it might be. So we personally need to really own our stories. Or is it something, if I really can't stand so-and-so and it's elevated to a toxic level, which often happens, and then you get into very high-level disrespectful workplace, it often gets into an investigation. But let's see how we can nip it in the bud early, personally. So what's the story? My story might be real. My story might be, I go talk to Tom, who's sitting cubicle next to me, and I say, when Lynn said that, it really made me feel uncomfortable. And he might be, yeah, it made me feel uncomfortable too. So you may not be alone. It may be a story that's actually fact. Other times, maybe it's just you, which is fine. Absolutely, it could elevate to a respectful workplace investigation. Having said that, how can you actually start owning the story in your own head about it? Whatever upset you about it. Maybe you need to give feedback to the person because it's not something obvious that the person would know would be offensive. So, and again, everyone's uniquely different. It doesn't make it right when someone says something, but if we give them feedback and they keep doing it, that's what makes it easy in terms of disrespect to really prove it within the workplace. So when you have a story, can you check it out with someone? Can you also walk tentatively, possibly? So we see and hear things. We tell our stories, creates feelings about the person. And this is where when things elevate to that level, such as oftentimes you'll get people who are very, there's a lot of animosity between them. You'll have different camps. So-and-so's talking to so-and-so about it, and the other person's talking to these other people about it. You get into whispering within the office. That can absolutely elevate, even sometimes on both sides, to disrespect, bullying behavior. So then we create these actions based on that. So I'm not going to talk to so-and-so. I'm going to ignore so-and-so. Ooh, I'm not going to tell this person something. And that absolutely elevates to bullying. So what do we need to do? We need to go back and tell ourselves, what's the story I'm telling myself about this person? What did they actually do that really offended me? And is it really worth this anxiety, this stress? How do I deal with it? Who can support me in this? How can I go talk to somebody? What does that look like? So each person within these sort of situations needs, or if I'm feeling like someone's ignoring me or not communicating with me, what's my role as an employee to do that? And how do I have an organization that supports those conversations and promotes those conversations? So your triggers, very quickly, I'm just going to run through this one last piece around how we individually deal with this. So we all know triggers. I've talked about them before. Things when we get really bothered by something and we get triggered, like a button gets pushed. We feel it differently in our body. So it may be in your head, it may be in your stomach, it may be in your toes, which I've heard before as well. But again, noticing that trigger, we know that we've become emotional. And in our world, stress is high. We have emotion is going to come out, whether it's something where we get really frustrated or we get anxious or we have lots of things on our plate and we're just feeling completely overwhelmed. But that can actually elevate us to a point where we're not going to communicate extremely well. We have to recognize that. We have to recognize that we emotionally are not at a place that we're going to be extremely, potentially respectful, but also we're not going to be in our best place. If we're going to get angry at someone when we shouldn't, if we're going to snap at somebody or ignore them when we shouldn't, it's often when we're emotional. Okay, so, and that emotion can be many, many different things. In the world of stress, though, you know, there's a perfect space in the middle. We need a little anxiousness, a little bit of pressure to perform. Otherwise, we're bored, right? We need to keep interest at work. We need to feel a little bit jazzed at work. But then oftentimes what I see is not that side of this chart. It's the other side on the right. We see people in strong, high anxiety, stress, markets are, let's face it, it's a tough market. I keep hearing it in your industry. So it's just a really tough market out there. What does it mean for the organization? Do we worry about our jobs? I don't know. Like, there's so many things that can happen in any industry, let alone when you guys are in a tough market. So how can that actually look? And when we're in those places, that's when we could say something we shouldn't. And when I see people, when they've lost it, or they've said something inappropriate, or, you know, have even quieter bullying, you know, in terms of talking to other people, etc., they're often in that high stress space. So we have to recognize when we're in there, and we have to recognize that every organization generally will be able to support us through that. It's just a matter of what your organization can do for you, or people outside your organization can do for you. So I've talked about anger before, around emotional intelligence, and anger is just one letter short of danger, right? And anger, as I've mentioned before, is actually not its own emotion. It's hiding another emotion. It's not a primary emotion. It's a secondary emotion. So in other words, anger is hiding all these other things I'm feeling. It could be some here, like hurt, abandoned, abused. It could be completely overwhelmed, and you're getting angry around it. Some people fight in terms of how they respond under stress, and some people flight, so they flee and they step back from their place. So recognizing that about us is really helpful in terms of respectful workplace, because I can guarantee you, if you're emotional, you are not coming across at your best. You are not showing up in your work environment at your best, from an engagement perspective and also a respectful workplace perspective. So organizations, you know, people talk about all the things that we do, all the things that we say. Sometimes we communicate respect in various ways. It's what we say or what we do, or it's what we don't do or what we don't say. And I would say that's one of the predominant things I see in terms of respectful workplace is what we don't, when we don't step in when we need to, as a colleague, as a leader, when we don't notice someone's emotions or we ignore someone's emotions, we have to notice it's a choice for us, right? It's our moment. Do we see how we're impacting others? Are we so caught up in our own anger and stress that we're not noticing other people? Okay, so it's your moment. It's your time to really shine. So very quickly, and we'll get onto the organizational element as well. So how can you be present, right? We're so caught up in all the things in our day. How can we be present? So whether you're a leader or you're a team member, can you notice when someone seems stressed? Do you notice when someone maybe is a little short with you when they shouldn't be? How can we support that person and not judge that person? Okay. Notice your impact, right? So maybe I was in a meeting and I was getting frustrated. Someone was talking over me and I just, you know, said something in a loud voice, or can I talk now, please? Or in a really aggressive way. Was there an impact? Did the person look completely mortified? Or were they, oh yeah, sorry, go ahead, right? So noticing the impact is critical, and paraphrasing and check for understanding. So something happens and maybe it is a little more heated discussion around something. So how do you feel about this? What are we walking away with here? How do you feel about this? How was this conversation for you? Asking some questions, getting them to paraphrase it back to you, what they're learning from the whole exchange is really important. And feedback, which of course you guys know I talk about all the time. So when I do investigations, again, not all the time I do, they're very time consuming. Feedback is one of the things that I noticed that could have prevented a significant portion of issues in terms of respect. So if if I don't know, it's my responsibility to give feedback. Now, feeling responsible to give feedback and actually giving it's a different, whole different ballgame, because it can be a lot of effort and stress just to give the feedback. But if there's an expectation that if I have good intentions, but I impacted you in a negative way, and I'm not going to know about it unless you tell me, then it absolutely is my responsibility to tell you. Maybe I do it with someone else. Maybe I do it through, ideally one-to-one, but through someone else as well. But leaders need to help facilitate those conversations. And come on, we all know them when someone comes in your office and then someone else comes in your office. If you're a leader and you've experienced that, it's very stressful. Facilitating a conversation where you give each other feedback and really get into what the stories they're telling themselves can be extremely beneficial to nip this stuff in the bud. Again, I'm not making it sound easy because I know it isn't. So recognizing reactions, emotions, and early signs of distress. A lot of leaders, when I walk into situations, whether they're a disengaging environment, toxic environment, often there's a disrespect involved, right? There's very few times I've ever seen it where respectful conversations have been occurring on a frequent basis. You can tell, you can almost feel it in a team. And if you're someone in another department, even sharing, gee, it's kind of stressful in there, what's going on? That can be very helpful for the leaders to really understand. Sometimes you get used to some things as well, which is not a good thing. In terms of respectful communication, so this actually was from the Kaleidoscope Institute, but I changed I changed a few of them there to sort of suit myself, but I want to give credit to them as well. So take responsibility for what you say and feel without blaming others, right? So this is where we can control it ourselves. Use empathetic listening. Be empathetic, listen to people. When they come in your office or your colleague complains about something, have empathetic listening. And I repeat, do not get into a bullying situation whereby you're talking behind someone's back in a very negative way, because that can absolutely elevate and you're going to be responsible for your own behavior. So sensitive to differences in communication styles. So again, a lot of times I've seen it's leadership style, it's communication style between people. So we all have different perspectives, right? So when I do assessment work, and if someone's a little bit more of a dominant behavior and a little bit more, let's get to business. I don't want to talk about your kids. I don't want to talk about this. That's okay. That's their style. Do not judge that style, and vice versa, right? If you're the person who wants to sort of have a little bit of a softer conversation first before you elevate into work conversation. So, recognize those, do not judge those. And I mentioned about assumptions and perceptions. When in doubt, check it out. If you're really not sure about something, check it out with the person involved, check it out with a colleague, and tell others how their actions may have affected those around you. Give them the feedback. Now, here's where we're going to get more into the organizational elements. And feel free, you can ask questions there as well if you're the one who's in charge of the respectful workplace policy or working with regard to respectful workplace. So these are just some things, I'm just going to put them all up here. These are some phrases that I've actually taken from investigations that I've done. And some of them may sound surprising, but believe it or not, I hear these things all the time. I couldn't take it anymore and I didn't know who to turn to. So often, like a situation right now, I just gave some advice to one organization around it with regard to talking to one of their employees who felt just they had to go to jump to a respectful workplace harassment complaint, but the organization didn't have the processes, they didn't have the ability to, they hadn't told their staff and really trained their staff in terms of what's available and what it means to go through a harassment complaint. it's not always an easy situation, and the outcome is not always what people want. So you need to have the training around it. So nobody says anything, and managers don't make it stop. This one ties in to the bottom one as well. Oh, that's just his way. Besides, he's a top performer. He'll never be touched. Someone's a top salesperson, but they're quote unquote leaving dead bodies in their wake back at the office, as an example. Or females too. I just have a he there. So when you think about those, does it matter? Does this person have the behavior that's required? Does this person have a very disengaging, toxic style at work, which is not only, and what I say to often to people is, that might be dandy that they're this person that you really want to keep, but at the end of the day, you've got 10 other people who are being dramatically impacted. So really thinking through as an organization, is it worth keeping that person? Or again, give them feedback, help them change. A lot of people know deep down, oh yeah, I'm probably a little bit that way, but they don't know the significance of the impact. They don't know that so-and-so went home almost in tears because of what they said. I can guarantee you those people do not go to work making people, wanting to make people cry or wanting to make people feel belittled. That's not what they want to do at all. It's just their approach that needs some tweaking. And sometimes it can very much be changed. I've been through orientation training and know this is unacceptable, and that organization says it doesn't tolerate that, but they do. So do people actually hold people accountable to it, including the leaders? Easier said than done, I know, but including the leaders, the head of the organization, right? Are they all living a respectful workplace and style? I'm not the one at fault, I'm the victim. I've heard that from both sides in investigations. I don't know what this person's talking about. They're putting this false accusation in, right? So it really gets defensive. If anyone ever comes to you and says, oh, you're just being this way or that way and completely disrespectful, or a complaint comes your way, take a breath, listen. It's not about your intentions. It is possible any of us could have said something that could have offended somebody. And if, again, over time, if we haven't been told, why would we stop that behavior, right? So there are mitigating circumstances in all these that obviously people won't lose their job for. So in terms of the bigger problem. So we've got a lot of issues in organizations. And when I work and I get those toxic situations, it absolutely always includes something that's unwelcome. So it's comments, behavior, gossip, slurs. And honestly, most people will agree at the end of the day that it is offensive. It inevitably leads to a complaint. And honestly, shame on the organization and the leaders for not holding themselves accountable. So I really sort of reflect back to organizations sometimes, okay, so what piece do you play in this? And 99% of the time, the leaders go, yeah, we let it go on longer than we should, right? And fair enough, we're human. We're humans. Hopefully that's a nice reminder if you have a situation on the go, to just dig into it, get the support you need to do so. So anything small, so nipping it in the bud means taking something small. When someone says something in the meeting that wasn't appropriate, you don't let it sit and see if it happens again. Oh, he's great, that's fine, or she's great, that's fine. Nip it in the bud. Say, FYI, when you said that, I think a number of people found it didn't sit well with them. Maybe next time you could use a different phrasing, something along those lines. Every person has to take care, that their conduct's not offensive to others. So it's, when I look at what was tolerated and is it today, people say, oh, things have changed. I argue that. I think it's quieter. I think people aren't as open about it, but I argue that it's not changed as much as it needs to be. And again, it's not about our intentions. It's really not. Now, if you say something and you still disagree that it shouldn't be offensive, it's irrelevant. It's absolutely irrelevant. I find this absurd. I didn't mean anything like that. Of course you didn't mean anything like that, but it doesn't mean it didn't happen. Okay, it doesn't mean it's harassment as such either. Sometimes it doesn't actually hit the harassment threshold, but it could be a matter of us really thinking about what we need to do. So make sure your fun is not mocking someone's pain and your enjoyment is not another's suffering. It doesn't take much for us to have an inside joke even that really makes someone feel completely uncomfortable, and over time that actually could be considered bullying. So what to do versus how to do it. So give feedback. I've told you that many, many times. I find the kicker is every single person involved knows they should have the conversation. You know, even if they don't agree that the person had been offended, if they have a sense that there was somebody who took something the wrong way, they know it, and they know they should have that conversation, and we don't. And oftentimes we don't. Number one, it's difficult. Let's face it. It's a difficult conversation. Secondly, do your leaders understand how to have those conversations? Do your team members, to other team members, know how to have that conversation? Can you, as a leader, if you are a leader, actually have someone in your office and actually help coach them or mentor them through a conversation, right? So that's where I see everything getting stuck. And if and understanding that is a requirement of the position as a leader. Now, team members, there's obviously a little bit more flexibility there, but they should absolutely bring it to the attention of somebody that they trust. And notice the symptoms. Sometimes you can see it. You can walk in and some people stop talking, or you'll walk into a room if it's, you know, or a department, and you'll be like, wow, this doesn't feel right. What's going on? And someone will say, oh, so-and-so just, you know, had it out with so-and-so, or whatever the heck it was, right? People have to start taking those and dealing with them quickly, be decisive about them, what is appropriate, what isn't appropriate, and make sure all parties are supported. So that's not just the person. If I lost my temper, or if I said something that may have been inappropriate, I need to be supported too, because we are human and we all have good intentions. So I got another little bit after in a couple of minutes, but I want to I want to throw out to you guys a situation. So a colleague comes to you very upset about an incident that happened in the lunchroom, and she says it is disrespectful workplaces because related to the disrespectful workplace policy. What do you actually do? So give me some thoughts. Again, there's no right or wrong here. What are some things you can consider? What could you say? Just think about it for a minute. Ooh, excellent. All right. So we've got encourage them to confront the person. Absolutely, it could be, right? It could certainly be, you know, can you give the person some feedback? It could maybe giving some advice around feedback. Yeah, and the nice, actually, I like how they tie together those comments. So the next one is take them away from the situation and ask them their side of the incident. So sometimes, yeah, just listening sometimes. Sometimes people just need to talk it through, and having that sense of outlet and having someone they can trust, right? They know it's fine. You know, I'm not going to share anything. I find a lot of people will kind of freak out and say, well, if I report it or if I talk to somebody, it's going to elevate. So, and I'll talk to that a little bit at the end when we talk about confidentiality, but it could just be listening. And sometimes people may not be ready to bring something forward, and that's okay. Now, again, at the end of the day, they have two choices: either let it go or make a decision about it and actually make a change or make a comment. But otherwise, sometimes they need some time to think it through, maybe deal with their emotions. So that really plays nicely into that. So listening to people, you know, oh my gosh, you know, you seem really upset, you know, do you want to share that with anyone? They would say, no, I'm not. Okay, fair enough. So what do you want to do with that information, right? Like, what do you need? How can I support you? Right? It could simply be that. If it's something you've heard 3 times before, it could come down to, you know, how is this affecting you? Because I see the stress in you. I see what's happening to you. And you can say there's 2 choices, right? You either deal with it or you have to learn to let it go. You know, can I help you, or can someone else help you? There's also, many organizations have EAP. They could call someone if it's really affecting them dramatically. And sometimes as well, they have situations going on at home. Right? So it's a double whammy. They're coming to work and they're not getting because let's face it, we've all had challenges at home in so many different ways in our lives. So they leave home with hopefully getting to a sanctuary at work where they can feel productive and part of a team, and maybe it's not that way at work. So that can be even more overwhelming for this person. So they could get a counselor through AAP. They can absolutely talk to, if you're lucky enough to have a human resources person there that they can go to in a confidential way, it could be very helpful. So again, there's no right or wrong here. I think the key is just to listen, not to get involved as such, right? I'm not saying you can't get involved. If you're a leader, absolutely. If it's another colleague and you want to facilitate your colleague, two colleagues, or and you want to try to help them, that's fine. But don't get into talking about them. Listen to them. Don't necessarily, I know they're terrible, they're this, they're that, whatever, just because it's going to rile them up. Right? So even if you think that way, maybe just listen to them, just a suggestion, listen to them, ask them what they want to do about it. If you would know that everyone else has an issue with it, maybe somebody should mention it, not necessarily that particular incident, if it's confidential, what the person told you, but maybe someone needs to elevate and say, so-and-so is really not impacting the team in a positive way. This person's approach or this person's, the way they speak or what they say or whatever it is needs to be brought up. And I can guarantee you the person doesn't know they're doing it most of the time. Okay, or they don't understand the extreme impact that they're having. All right, thanks for that. I appreciate your contribution there, folks. So employee responsibilities. I'm going to get into some policy stuff now, but it really does make a difference if anybody on the call is heavily involved with making sure that this is done properly. Here, I'll give you some tips for sure. So as an employer, or someone who's in charge of Respectful Workplace or a leader within the organization, you have to make sure that you have a policy statement. You want to make sure that you do everything possible to prevent harassment in the workplace. So that includes things such as training, making sure the leaders know how to deal with someone who comes into their office with an issue. That's where I find, the policy statements can be great, but until the rubber hits the road and the person's in their office getting upset about it, they don't know how to react to that. Someone gets very emotional in their office. Are they going to be respectful in how they respond to them, as an example? It could be anger. It could be multiple different types of emotions. So do they have investigation procedures? Is it very specifically, Alan, here's exactly what happens? Oftentimes there's formal investigations and informal investigations. Do you have those mapped out and what they could look like? Obviously, many of you are not in unionized environments, which actually would have a standard process, but this is where you kind of need a similar process around here's step one, here's step two, here's the people you can talk to, here's the responsibilities of all the different parties. And onboarding. So when people get brought into the organization, make sure they read your Respectful Workplace, ideally sign it in terms of their agreement to, acting in a way that is respectful, not this policy in terms of procedures wise, but the overall policy statement that they do align with that. Review it on a frequent basis, talk about respect in the workplace. And respect, you don't have to necessarily use the word respect as well. You can talk about, we want to be, some people say civil, but it could just be engaging. We want to be respectful in terms of how we work with each other. We want to make sure our behavior is positive, right? There's lots of different words you can use. In terms of policy and procedures, so some basic things that you really need to include. So purpose, scope, and definitions. There's so many ones you can get off online. There's lots of things you can look at from your local organization. Sometimes you get organizations like governmental, which have really good ones you can beg, borrow, and steal, right? Bits and pieces, they don't mind. They're happy if people use them in most cases. So responsibilities of the organization, the leaders, and the employees. So if I'm a colleague, as I said in the beginning of the last session, what's the responsibility of each party? If I see someone who's being harassed or bullied or violence in the workplace for that matter, because oftentimes that gets included as well in the same policy, what does that look like? What are my responsibilities? What are the steps that I take at each of those levels? And most times it'll speak to leaders in a much higher level of responsibility. Okay, so if you are subjected to harassment, what's the complaint process, right? And those informal and formal routes. Who to tell? What are the obligations? Is there a time frame? Some organizations have very close-knit time frames, which can be cumbersome sometimes if it's a really complicated situation, and you have to get all the parties' approval to extend it. But you can, if that's what you feel like you want to do. Who do you tell? Here's a fun one. What if it's the head of the organization? So let's say it's a private organization. Is there somebody specifically in the senior leadership if it's the head of the organization, if there's a CEO in the organization, right? What if it's that person? What is the process? Because that is one of the most complicated ones that I've ever had to deal with. If there's a board, that's different because you can go through the board. What if it's the board chair, right? If it's a board situation. So, but some of you may also be involved with volunteer organizations as well. So investigation process, what does it look like? What are the responsibilities? Internally, so what that looks like, would it be two managers that weren't involved? Say it was two managers of a different department would be involved. HR, obviously, if they're there, would be a primary person that would be involved. Now, the big one is you should always have the ability to have a third party. So when does it go to a third party? For example, if it was the CEO, absolutely it should go to a third party, because how in the world could anyone who worked for this person, be unbiased and impartial with regard to an investigation? Third party can also be if it elevates to a certain level, or sometimes if an internal investigation's been done and all parties are still not happy with the outcome. In terms of the roles of witnesses, that's a big one. Complainant and respondent, absolutely, such that if I'm the complainant, the person who's complaining, then normally there has to be a written statement. Okay, so sometimes people go for informally, they'll have a verbal statement you can have, or initially a verbal statement, but if it gets to a formal process, usually there needs to be a written statement. I highly recommend that. It can be done on their own, it can be done in tandem with someone else. If there's HR, obviously, they could actually even help draft it if needed. Obviously not in their words, in the complainant's words. The respondent then, what their role is. So what's their time frame to respond? Do they have to do a written response, right? In other words, here's what happened in my view. Here's what I agree with. Here's what I don't agree with. It's really hard for the respondent, and I've seen it in times when the person absolutely is in breach of respectful workplace policies, and even when they're not, it's a very difficult time for that person. So again, what's their role? How do they respond? They need to have those supports as well. Obviously, the complainant will get those. Witnesses are really important. I often see sometimes organizations not having it written in their policy, just to make sure people understand that if I see something, I should be speaking up. If I'm a witness and I'm called into an investigation, even an informal one, I'm just, what? There was an incident, as you know, in the lunchroom on this day. What did you see or hear? Right? There's an obligation as an employee to do that and be responsive. They can't say no as such when you get to an investigation perspective. And I mentioned as well, it was a leader. Retaliation is something you should absolutely have in there as well, which is with regard to multiple things. So it's either there's a complaint out and the people who are being called in for witnesses, maybe they're angry and they retaliate. That's unacceptable. The respondent or the complainant could retaliate in a negative, disrespectful way. Again, I can't say how important it is to have a very firm stance on that. So if you have a situation, even if it's informal, to say retaliation will not be acceptable. And it could be, again, in your policy, it would have consequences up to and including termination. So it sounds firm, but let me tell you, things can go way out of whack in an organization very quickly. Then talk about getting sides, picking sides, and escalating dramatically. It can absolutely do so. And finally, remedy. So remedy is really what happens. One of the hardest things when you're dealing with respectful workplace I find when it gets to my level, or I've been brought in, or somebody I know, other investigators have been brought in, with remedy is an assumption, which I mentioned before, the assumption that the person's going to get fired, right? People really need to understand what it means to go through an investigation, what the outcomes are, the fact that, which I'll get into now in confidentiality, they won't see the report. They're not going to see necessarily the report, right? If there are statements going back and forth, they should absolutely see the statements. In terms of what the person says in response to the complaint, as an example. The respondent absolutely needs to see things. They need to see things if there's changes to the statement, etc., because it could affect their career, and their job. So, understanding what is confidential, what isn't, but understanding what can actually happen at the end of the day. At the end of the day, so-and-so, the CEO and so-and-so are going to review and make a call. on whether it was a breach of policy or not, or the HR person and the CEO, whoever it might be, is going to make a call on if it's a breach or not, and they'll have a written report as opposed to if it is or isn't. And then people need to know of what it could be, but they may not know what actually happens. There's no obligation to tell them that this person now has gotten a slap on the wrist and a note in their file. If there was a breach, they will probably know, yes, there was a breach of policy, and we will be dealing with it internally. They may not, the complainant may not even know what happened. So the person could be off with pay for 2 weeks. There could be anger management counseling, which I hear a lot, that gets mandated. It could be respectful workplace training that gets mandated for the person, but it's not something that the general population is going to know, and possibly not the complainant is going to know. They just have to trust the system that things are going to work. Now, having said that, then if something happens again, there's much a firmer stance on what could happen. So if the person has another breach, that just adds to it and it compounds it and it makes it that much worse. So hopefully that helps a little bit. I know it's a little dry, but anything I can do to help sort of mitigate the risk for you folks in terms of dealing with these, is it only takes one to throw everything out of whack. So confidentiality is really critical. So sometimes I even get called in when it's something highly sensitive because of the confidential nature of what's going on. And there are absolutely lots of investigators, by the way, in Nova Scotia as well. I know people in our firm do it as well in Nova Scotia. So, you know, pull in somebody if it's really tangly. It's worth every penny, let me tell you. Because if it ever went to court down the road, God forbid, you got to have all your ducks in a row. And when investigators write reports, they know it could end up either in arbitration if it's a union, or in court if it went beyond, if a lawyer got involved. So confidentiality is key. The minimum number of people that need to know about it will know about it. The minimum number, and I mean absolute minimum, that need to be involved will be. So the minimum number of witnesses to say whether it's a breach or not, the minimum number of people reading the statements, the minimum number of people that actually know an investigation's occurring. Easier said than done, I know, but absolutely, right? So can interviews be done quietly in another part, in a section, a quieter section of the office? Can it be done, you know, and again, witnesses, to tell witnesses, this is a confidential process. So anything, you know, because if you're asking them questions around a certain incident, they can't just go out and tell everybody what they said or what the questions were. And that's something that should absolutely be written in your policy in terms of confidentiality and held to a very high standard. Because if things get beyond that, then you're getting into a whole other ramifications, from engagement issues to legal issues to whatever. So when in doubt, make sure you have those in place. So that's when things go wrong, right? And my job, I always sort of say, is I like to go in when things maybe are a little bit tangly, but don't get to an investigation, because then you're just looking at some issues within an organization. Maybe there's some tension, and maybe there's some elephants that need to be put out on the table. Those are the things that people should be brought in to do, or people within your organization can step up and nip in the bud. The accountability piece plays heavily into this for yourself, for anyone within your organization. We don't want to scare people. We don't want to make them feel, this is a team. It's no different than a family. If we see something going wrong, if we see something not, you know, someone doing something that doesn't fit with who we are and doesn't affect someone a certain way, then we really need to see it. We need to own it and say, well, what's my role? What's my role within the organization? Well, it's, gosh, it's my boss. Like, what am I supposed to do with that? Right? So I see something and it's my boss talking to one of the other bosses. How do I deal with that? Right? People, you need to have those conversations with the teams. They need to know who they should talk to and how they need to own it. And owning it could be simply just a little quiet conversation with somebody that you trust in the organization. Solving it at the leadership level, absolutely. Something needs to happen quickly. Again, quickly is the key. And they need to be held accountable for that. Because oftentimes what we do below the line is we sort of go into, oh, I don't want to be involved with this. Let's just wait and see what happens. I'm just going to ignore it. It's probably going to go away. I'm too tired. Here's one that we can all relate to. I'm tired, I'm exhausted, and I just can't deal with this today. And that might be fine, but we darn well better be dealing with it tomorrow. It's not my job, should not come into play here. If we've done our job in terms of training staff, talking to staff, being open about this with staff, about what we tolerate, what isn't tolerable, conversations around what is harassment, what isn't harassment, right? Get them to do little, there's lots of activities you can get online to have discussions around what it looks like, and inclusivity as well, right? Sometimes I see organizations that get dysfunctional as much as, respectful workplace probably as well, with regard to little groups that kind of stick together, right? It's on the edge. It could turn into bullying, but again, it's a matter of how do you actually see those things and try to be more inclusive as an organization. We really need to bring those things in. So I think I got all that in there, and apologies for speaking so quickly. It's a big topic. It's not a fun topic, but I'd like to think that if you can take a couple of pieces from this session and the last session that you can bring into your organization. There's lots of information online. Just do it before things go wrong. And if you have a situation, or even there's a current situation ongoing, just sort of think in your head about what is my responsibility? What's the organization's responsibility? When in doubt, get more people involved from a professional perspective if you don't have HR in-house, as an example. If you have HR in-house and they think it's beyond their capabilities, bring in the big guns, right? And again, confidentiality is key. Have your processes, have your policies. I know you guys are good with this stuff because you're in a very sort of, I wouldn't say regulated environment, but a very process and procedure environment for your clients. So you understand process procedure. So make sure it works in terms of respectful workplace as well. I hope that was helpful. Please let me know if it was. I kind of threw a lot at you today, and we didn't have a lot of back and forth. So it's the last one now, the last session. So have a lovely summer. I know it's a beautiful 21 degrees here today, so hopefully it's the same up your way. I think we're all getting rain on the weekend. So enjoy your summer. Thank you so much for putting up with me the last 9 months or so. And yeah, here's hoping you and your family have a lovely summer. Thanks so much.